Hi everyone, and welcome to this daily critique where I'm going to be discussing the images of Julian Oellrich, and hopefully I've got that pronunciation vaguely right. There's no specific theme to this video. I will briefly discuss how you might select the best photo from two or more similar photos, but other than that, the processing standard is very high, so we're going to focus mostly on composition. Let's get going. So here are the images that Julian sent in. It looks like we've got 4 images of the Dolomites here and then 2 of what I assume is the Faroe Islands. So we're going to start with the meat of this video, which is to discuss how to choose between 2 similar images. So we have 2 very similar images here, and I'm just going to compare them by pressing the C key in Lightroom, and then we can discuss the differences between the 2. And unfortunately I can't draw on these, but I'm sure you'll get the idea. Now these are obviously taken a matter of minutes apart. The one on the right's taken a little later, so you can see the light getting redder and softer on the peaks. But fundamentally we have the same kind of conditions. There's a bit more intense light on this left image, softer, warmer light on the right-hand image. The cloud setup is more or less the same. There's a nice little drifting detail of cloud maybe on this left-hand side image. But fundamentally, I would focus on a number of different things when I am trying to choose between images, and the primary one has to be composition. So in this case, for me, it's actually quite easy to decide between the 2 because one crop effectively is much stronger. This image on the right, there's that asymmetry that I would generally look for if I can in an image. I find it more interesting visually generally. Sometimes symmetrical compositions do work well, but mostly asymmetry is preferable. And I think that this mountain on the right hand side is a perfect counterbalance to the sunlit rocks on the left, and I think that's actually really nicely arranged, and that more focused composition also brings some scale to the mountains, so to me they look more dramatic, even though arguably the light is slightly preferable in that left hand side image. But more than that, this right hand side just doesn't really tie together with the left hand side of the image. So if you're talking about how coherent the subject is, I also prefer the right hand image for that reason. So you can get quite picky about the differences between images, and you shoot these multiple variations and you can't decide at the time which one to go for. When you're shooting the same composition, generally you just need to pick one. It's a bit of a scourge of modern photography that everybody wants to present every moment of a sunset as the sun goes down with all these slight variations on composition. Now these compositional differences are quite significant, to the point that somebody might, for example, buy a print of the image on the left and not of the image on the right, and vice versa. So you might want to consider that if if there's a financial aspect to it. But otherwise, I would select the image that most clearly represents your vision, what struck you about the scene at the time, and just be decisive, because at the end of the day both images are very beautiful, and I think you can dilute your body of work by presenting multiple variations, because it shows indecisiveness and sort of a lack of creative direction, if that makes sense. So for me it would be this image on the right. I also love the blues. For some people it would be the image on the left, but either way, make a decision, and I would recommend not presenting both to the general public. So that said, let's do a quick critique of the image on the right, because some of the points will be the same, and as I mentioned, I think this is a really beautiful image. There's a couple of minor distractions. I mean, it's a bit of a pity in some ways that there's a ski slope running through this. In fact, although the wider view diminishes that ski slope, you also start to bring in ski areas on the right hand side there. So that's slightly unfortunate, but visually it really doesn't spoil the image, and it certainly makes me want to go skiing in this area. I mean, I didn't actually know you could ski amongst peaks like this, so I'm going to be finding out where this is pretty promptly after recording this video. But really, the biggest problem for me is not the edit. I think the edit's really great. It's just the natural characteristic of the scene, which is this mass of open sky right above the mountains here. And were I to crop this, and I will hypothetically just crop right in here and unlock that there, so that you can't see any clear sky at all, then it just gets a little bit too tight on the top of that mountain. But you can see how tonally that works so much better. Your eye doesn't get dragged out at the top of the frame. So that really is far preferable, in my opinion, to be able to have that cloud continuing. So those of you who like your Photoshop would no doubt be happy to clone the clouds in just to fill in enough space so that, for example, you could maybe crop up to somewhere like here. But one thing I would do is crop to somewhere like there, even if I weren't cloning the clouds in, and then I would work locally to darken this area. So, I mean, a nasty way that can actually work quite well is just to do a select color on the area, and you'd have to try and darken this down a little bit more in Lightroom to sort of help it on its way. But rather than using luminosity masks here, you can just try and locally select that area, and then change the fuzziness accordingly. And then just dial back that adjustment until you're sort of helping it on its way. So you can't see that horrible halo, but it just starts to darken that area, because you don't want that bright white, the brightest area of the image, to be right at the top of your frame. And then you can maybe add an additional curve over the top. So this time I'm just going to do a soft gradient. Do something like that, and I haven't actually got white here, so there we go. And then you can see just how that helps to hold the eye in. So I really would crop the top of this frame. I'd also clone out that dust spot just there. And as you do that, you possibly want to bring up this bottom edge as well, and I'd maybe look to remove that little cabin there at the bottom. So I am switching to more of a panoramic format here. But that's the way I would go with that image. That would be my style, roughly, something like that. So let's move on to these images of the fjords in the Faroe Islands. Two images that would work absolutely beautifully as a pair. Really nice square crops. Square crop will slow your eye down. It will create a sense of geometry or enhance the natural sense of geometry. So I actually think that with these fairly pyramidal peaks, it's a really effective choice of format. The editing is also great. I'm not going to show you the raw files because it's just very tastefully done. These clouds are just perfect for shooting these kind of landscapes. Very understated, but with a lot of interest, a lot of feeling, and a lovely color contrast. So it would be a big mistake here to select a warmer white balance to warm up this natural light even more, because you would lose that lovely color contrast between the sort of steel blue grays in the distance and this sunlit mountain which comes forward beautifully. And similarly with this one, although the blue is obviously less clear, but a lovely sense of geometry, and I really like the way that this all fits together as an image. I don't really need to draw all over it for you to identify the elements. So really great two images there, but what I would say is that they are not standalone single images necessarily. I mean, I guess in a modern home in particular, this one would work really nicely on its own, but as a series of two or three, I think they're really fantastic. I'd love to see a third, actually. Okay, now having been spoilt by these two images of the Dolomites, this one misses the mark for me because it just doesn't have the top of the mountains. It really is as simple as that. If I see mountains reaching upwards, I want to see the tops of them. There are some cases where that's less of a problem. You know, if you shot a more focused composition, much tighter in on here, there might be something of interest, and the mountain disappearing into the cloud would be less of a problem, because it would be more about the texture of the mountain and the scale of the mountain, rather than a literal grand landscape shot, even if it is at a medium focal length, that appears to be all about the mountain, but you can't see the top of it. I just find that visually quite frustrating. The light's very nice. It's been processed pretty well. I'd actually process this a little more myself, actually. I'd darken that sky a tiny bit more still, just to bring in a bit of additional drama, but maybe not quite that much. But I mean, a perfect, well executed shot, it just needs to have that mountain free of cloud. And it does mean that when I go to mountain areas, often I just don't shoot photos of the mountains if the tops are in cloud. I just find it a little bit too frustrating. And finally, onto this beautifully lit image. I assume this is also of the Dolomites. Really nice contrast of light and shade, light in the foreground, shadow in the midground, and then a beautifully lit peak at the back with these stunning clouds overhead. Maybe on the left-hand side it's a bit too bright, so I just darken that down were I to keep the composition the same as it is. But I do have a couple of suggestions on the composition. So there's two issues that I have with it. The first is that it just appears to be a little bit right heavy. So the mountain is on the right-hand side, and so is this sunlit slope, which is naturally going to draw some of your interest. The lake itself is fairly central, although that's maybe being unfair. Let's say it's there. And then the flowers are very much on the right hand side again, so there's relatively little going on this left hand side. So the first thing I'm thinking when I look at this is, okay, I may be able to change what the foreground looks like, but I probably can't change the arrangement of the background without walking a reasonable distance. So how can I make that better? Well, I'd probably put the frame edges roughly here and here. I think that then helps to, I mean, you could include as much sky as you wanted, of course, at the top. I think that helps to create a stronger balance there and focus more on the mountain in the background. But you've also then got to rearrange your foreground. I mean, as it is, the second problem I see is there's a bit of a disconnect between the flowers here and then this midground, which is partly caused by the fact that the midground is in shadow, but there's no real follow through. I mean, you do have these flowers here, but they don't quite catch the eye enough, so there's no way that you sort of follow through there. And I think that amount of space from here to here basically is enhanced by the fact that the space between the flowers and the bottom of the frame is relatively small, so that to me just makes this this central area look even larger, although whether other people have that experience, I have no idea. So I'd frame up the background something like this. So I'm choosing a longer focal length essentially, and then what I'd look to do is get further back and lower down, so that as I zoom in, the flowers get slightly larger and move up into the frame. So maybe something like this would be possible. So then when we sort of finish drawing the frame off, if you like, you end up with something a bit more like this. So that would be what I would kind of try to aim at. I may be being really unfair to Julian here, because of course this may be totally impossible. I mean, there could be a rock wall immediately behind him, or even a slope that was similarly steep to this could be enough to make that composition impossible. But those are the kind of things that I'm thinking when I'm looking at this. So really nice image. I just make a couple of changes there if possible. And really enjoyed working through these, Julian, particularly these two at the start, these two similar images, really beautiful, great processing, lovely lighting, and then these two of the fjords, which work so brilliantly together. So thank you very much for sending those in.